I asked a question in a group on Facebook about uniforms in martial arts, and if anybody could pick one that predated, uh, Akano's judo gi and everything that has kind of followed since that, i.e., uh, is there something out there akin to a martial arts uniform um, that is not a direct response to the success and kind of zeitgeist of what happened, the commercialization of judo that went into karate, was picked up by kung fu and other Southeast Asian martial arts, and I mean even Filipino martial arts, modern arnis. Remy Presses and Ernesto Presses, these were karate guys that were also practicing their own native weapons fighting, and they came up with a karate style, aesthetic for their art. Um, this is not to say that everybody took the gi. It's more to say that somebody came up with the idea of like there was a uniform now, not just gym clothes. And and I wanted to know, like, are there any history nerds out there who are smarter than me that can identify something that would be a legit uniform prior, for martial arts, specifically civilian martial arts? We'll get into that in a second. Well, that sentence off my head. So we need to go over a couple of things to set this up, the criteria for what I'm talking about. And that really is like, what is in a uniform? Like, what makes a uniform? Number one thing I want to discount is military uniforms. And the reason I want to discount military uniforms is military uniforms would not have been made for whatever martial art they were practicing. Military uniforms would have been designed around the idea of identification of your own side in a conflict. And I mean, more so that than anything else, but also to kind of coalesce people into a feeling of unity and oneness. And obviously, the uniform would have had to have served a certain functionality, right? You wouldn't dress a warrior in lace lingerie, because that just would not serve the purpose, the function of being a warrior. Naked Celts be damned, right? So if we go back in time, obviously, we have the art of heraldry, knights wearing surcoats and, big battle standards being raised so that people could see, this is where my people are. These like identifying marks of who's my people, who's not my people. Why is this? Well, because people, especially in very localized regions, are going to, for the most part, look similar. And when you're dealing with a large enough people, not everybody personally knows everybody. And then when people are wearing armor and covered in blood and muck and whatnot, it may be difficult to identify somebody by their face, by their features. And if people aren't necessarily speaking, you may not be able to identify them by their language. So in large part, uniforms from the military were designed for identification purposes more so than anything else. So I'm discounting that from the martial arts thing, because military uniforms would have been created by nobility, would have been created for the sake of the battlefield and all of that, not for the sake of kind of like club membership identification. So we are talking more in the realm of civilian martial arts, which would be much more akin to like gang membership as opposed to military membership. Uniform is a uniform, but you know what I'm saying. The other thing that I wanted to discount was equipment, like sporting equipment, as opposed to an aesthetic uniform. And again, the idea of sporting equipment being that sporting equipment is necessarily going to influence how a practice is carried out, and the practice is going to adapt itself to the confines of the equipment being used. In some cases, if you look at, say, like some of the belted glima and some of the jacket wrestling styles, of which there are actually many more than you might think, the specific grips and whatnot based on the type of jacket being worn or based on the belts or the Mongolian, the Zodag or Shudag, I don't remember which is which, but like there are specific shapes and styles and things, and grips will be determinant on what's available there. Even when you look at like armored fighting, when you look at armor, like the way that you grapple with somebody or strike somebody in armor is going to be very dependent on what type of armor it is and how you've trained around that. Obviously, weapons and safety like gloves, hand wraps, things like that are going to come into it. Even down to the fact that in Western sporting, we tend to go shirtless, you could probably bring that back all the way to the Greeks fighting in the nude, but also a holdover from fencing and the fact that you would strip down to the waist for fencing, because especially if you're doing a first blood duel, your clothing getting into a wound would cause you to go septic and you would die. To the point where there's even a fairly famous duel between women. I don't know if this was the 1700s or early 1800s, but they were told to strip to the waist as well, because you don't want to deal with an infection from clothing getting into a wound. It was something they were not equipped medically to handle back then. So yeah, boxers and wrestlers and whatnot wearing either skin tight singlets or stripping to the waist seems to be a holdover from possibly Greek sporting that was in the nude, and fencing society, fencing culture, which was trying to avoid afterburn infections and whatnot from that. So equipment and military are going to be kind of shuffled off to the side, because you wouldn't call wearing necessary equipment to practice your art a uniform, because it doesn't really satisfy the requirements of being a uniform. And the military thing is it doesn't really satisfy the question, because we're talking about martial arts culture, which largely has become more of a civilian thing as opposed to a military thing, the way that we conceptualize martial arts in the modern world. And so that's going to be kind of a separate thing. In fact, people in the military may have practiced quite disparate martial arts personally, privately, but would have been wearing a uniform based on being in a certain company, being in a certain clan or whatever. So that's why we're discounting that. So then the question is, like, what really is a uniform? Well, let's look at the language. Now I'm using English here because I'm talking English. If you speak another language, these definitions may be more or less accurate. I wouldn't know. So let's first, what does equipment mean, right? Equipment, right, comes from French and possibly a loan word from Old Norse, Germanic, which is rare for French. French usually goes back, through Italian and Latin, but okay. It means to fit out or to load on board a ship, right? The idea is equipment or equipping something is literally just to kind of load something on. And so generally speaking, you could identify equipment or define equipment as stuff of utility or necessity to practice or perform, carry out a task, whatever. Also, you could look at the word gear, which in the sense that we're using it like equipment, literally means to make or construct something, and eventually means equipment, to make or construct equipment to be loaded out, right? So it's just one step down the chain or up the chain, depending on how you want to phrase that. I decided to throw in costume here too, because some people will use costume, and especially when you consider that the martial arts that we practice in the modern day are often of a somewhat historical nature, it almost becomes like a historical or cultural cosplay, in the sense of outside of putting on a judo gi, which was specifically designed for judo. Outside of that, when you look at like a lot of other Japanese martial arts, they dress specifically in like the kimono and hakama, and I might be using the wrong clothing terms because there's a whole bunch of different clothing terms. So just kind of discount that for the moment and just understand that what I'm saying is a lot of the traditional Japanese arts, right? The old style, the Koryu style arts, they are using the traditional Japanese clothing, and it becomes a sort of historical cosplay. And if you are not of Japanese descent, it's even a bit of a cultural historical cosplay. Same thing with Chinese martial arts. Chinese martial arts have never really had a uniform, and yet we see so much distinct stuff. And why is that? Well, because there was a certain style of clothing that people wore, and the style of clothing that people wore for training was going to be kind of the same style of clothing that people wore for working. Common civilian clothes that was easy to move in, and that they could exercise in and whatnot. I mean, it's the same thing you see over and over and over again. People are just wearing clothing that is appropriate to exercise in, and over time, people start going, well, I'm going to dress like our ancestors did, and wear certain clothing, certain styles of shoes, certain shirts, a cloth sash, things like that. And by the way, cloth sashes are completely universal. Whether it's a thicker, layered belt, or if it's a wrapped cloth sash, that's pretty ubiquitous. I mean, the old boxers wore cloth sashes to hold up their pants. This is just kind of a thing that people did. It was fairly easy to just get a length of fabric, and the wealthier you were, the nicer the fabric, the better the construction and everything. But for the most part, getting a length of fabric or rope to hold up your pants, or to hold closed a garment that doesn't have fasteners, because fasteners would have been expensive, is a fairly common thing. So don't for a second think that just because somebody's wearing a sash or a cloth belt, they're immediately mimicking Asian martial arts. That is simply not true. That is a fairly universal constant. But anyway, the idea here is that people will often wear clothing that is just more in line with the culture that the art or skill that they're practicing comes from. And costume is actually a really good word. And, we kind of will poke fun and call it cosplay. But the fact is, there's no shame in that. I don't think there's a problem with cosplay. I mean, and in fact, I think cosplay can be kind of fun. And I've engaged in cosplay, albeit more on the actual fantasy comic book kind of side of things. But that's, that's neither here nor there. The point is that costume is not some derogatory term. My Superman inspired version of our sun shield is a sort of kind of costume, right? And in a sense, it is pointing to inspirational, aspirational heroes, but then also emblematic of our brand. And again, when you look at it, costume really goes back to the word custom, which makes sense, right? Or habit or usage, right? Which eventually kind of meant fashion and habit, right? And it comes from Latin, but it comes to us through French and Italian. And nowadays, we use it to mean custom or usage with respect to a specific place or time, and often, if we're talking historically, represented in art. And the reason why represented in art is so fundamental to it is you're talking about something that is so ubiquitous that it actually makes its way into the representations of a culture or a group, a time, place, whatever. And that's pretty important, because things that just are versus things that get represented and preserved kind of tells you the difference between what's really the it factor and what's not, right? So calling things costume is not a slight by any stretch of the imagination. I understand that it does feel like it downplays kind of what you're talking about, but costume is a perfectly fine and perfectly accurate word for kind of dressing up. I mean, hell, if you look at the way that people get dressed to go to the gym, there's a certain costume that people wear to go to the gym. Gym clothes have a certain kind of aesthetic. I mean, it's a wide varying thing, but certain gym clothes have a certain aesthetic that kind of lends to the idea of this goes with that, right? And that's pretty good, right? And the thing with costume is that costume gives you a lot of latitude for individual variability or general variability, whereas uniform, which is what we're getting to now, it really means just to have one form or shape. And again, Latin via French, right? Distinctive clothes worn by one group is kind of the general definition here, right? We're saying like it is something to aesthetically distinguish, to identify. It's an identifying mark, right? And yes, it has to satisfy the equipment side of things. It has to be functional for its intended purpose. And it's probably going to satisfy the costume requirements as well, but it's going to be more specific to a specific group, which may be an organization. It might be, again, it could be a gang, it could be a business, it could be a military, it could be any number of things, right? A sports team. And having a uniform is going to be further identification down from costume to everybody in that group being specific to a thing. Like, you're not going to have a uniform if you're a solo operator. Solo operators basically don't get uniforms because solo operators are not a group. You'd have to have at least two people in order to be a group of any sort that are at least in the ballpark of having the same kind of look. And this is where you get things like flight suits and coveralls and work shirts and, name tags and things like that. Or even just dress codes. Dress codes become a certain kind of uniform. Dress codes kind of straddle between costume and uniform, whereas a uniform tends to be a little bit more prescriptive. But this brings us back to the original point, right? How many martial arts actually have what you would call like a purposeful uniform, something that is an identifiable, mark, a distinctive mark of identification for their art, their school, their style, or whatever? How many of them have that going back before, Kano instituting the judogi? And bear in mind, the judogi really is equipment. It wasn't, a uniform per se. It became a uniform for karate. Because when Funakoshi adopted it for karate, it was more about like an aesthetic, like saying, hey, there's gym clothes, but then also like everybody will have this sense of uniformity, and we're trying to put this into the schools and get people ready for the military. And there's a certain level of it became an identifying mark when it passed from judo to karate. But in that sense, right, it spread from there to the Kung Fu world, to the Silat world, to at least to parts of the Silat world, to parts of the FMA world. Most of the other arts that I'm familiar with, at least, mostly just have equipment. They have gear that they use for the practice of their sport. But, I don't think there's a problem necessarily with having a costume or a uniform. Despite what people want to say, aesthetics are somewhat important. Aesthetics help you identify things at first glance, right? And yes, there are lots of ways to cheat aesthetics, and that's a whole other story. And we're not really talking about that for the moment. But the overall point is that like aesthetics are important to a degree. They are psychological markers that we can look at first glance and say, oh, this means that. Or at least as an initial diagnostic, it says this could mean that, and I should investigate further. At least if it's in the ballpark of what you're looking for. And that's pretty interesting, right? So I don't think there's a problem with having, an aesthetic sense. And like when you look at just the proliferation of the dogi, starting with judo, and keep in mind, even with judo, it started off with shorter sleeves, like either 3/4 length, elbow length sleeves, and more or less breeches level pants, not full length pants. And eventually became long sleeves and long trouser legs. But you look at that going into karate, mostly stays the same. Although because karate doesn't necessarily use the gi in the same way for the grips and stuff, they oftentimes will make it of a lighter weight. When you move that into, say, Taekwondo, and Taekwondo went with the pullover V-neck. Because again, it's not even necessary to have the lapels because they're not using those grips in any functional way. And the lapels keep things from opening up and whatnot, and that creates a certain functionality. You look at the Chinese martial arts, and they often use frog button jackets, and not exclusively, but quite often, right? Very, very, very common. And sometimes you have sleeveless, sometimes you have short sleeves, sometimes you have long sleeves. Almost always you have long flowy pants. Oftentimes you have a silk or silk-like material, as opposed to a more sturdy, thick, cottony, hempy, canvasy material. But again, not exclusively, just quite often. The belt differences too, right? The Kung Fu tends to use a more, broad, flowy, silky sash as opposed to the specific, developed for judo and karate belt. And then when you look at like the Kun Tao Silat people, their uniform's a little different still, but it still kind of looks in that ballpark of like, oh yeah, they're still doing that thing. And when you look at modern Arnis, right, their jacket is short sleeve and very short waisted. But again, they took that idea and were like, well, let's make it a little more ours, but we're still doing that thing. I think that I don't even know if the pancration movement, which was like kind of like point fighting karate, I don't know, I wasn't that impressed with it. But when the pancration movement was coming back in, they did kind of like some kind of like a tunic with a sash thing. And I'm all for like training tunics. Why not? Why not have like a medieval Viking, even Renaissance style tunic? Or why not having some of the Renaissance doublets and stuff, like a grappling doublet, and some HEMA schools are actually using some forms of like grappling jackets and stuff that are more based on Renaissance aesthetics. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, and what about the jacket wrestling from the West? I mean, they came up recently, the Irish collar and elbow resurgence has come up with something that is a little more akin to what we considered like a Western business jacket, but it's got shorter sleeves. And, as far as I know, they just still made it like a durable grappling jacket, but a little bit more in the Western aesthetic. Now, they did that specifically for collar and elbow because there wasn't a collar and elbow specific training jacket. They would just use the jackets they had. But the point is that I don't have a problem with any of that. And the fact is that it's all kind of coming in off of Kano's judo gi. And the reason for that is, well, it's a pretty honestly good design because you're talking about all soft material. You're talking about being able to design it specifically for grappling or lighten it up for, things that don't involve clothing grips. Having something that's mobile and usable, but having something that has a certain aesthetic. It's a good platform, and it has proliferated so much, which is kind of neat. It's kind of cool. So anyway, just something to think about, right? Aesthetics are kind of important, and equipment, costumes, and uniforms are not all the same thing. There is a significant amount of overlap. So I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to ruminate on it. You ruminate on it. We're still not going to do uniforms. We're just going to have t-shirts, and feel free to buy one. It's not membership to the club or designation of rank, but if you like what we do, buy a shirt. And I'll talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials. And please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.